Well, hello, Hyrule historians. Birdkeeper Toby here, and I saw the new trailer for Breath of the Wild 2. I know it was only a teaser, but seeing that destroyed Master Sword was really, really cool. And it got me thinking about a theory that I used to talk about and still believe, to be honest, that unfortunately no longer makes sense as a result of the release of the Hyrule Historia 10 years ago. However, the Hyrule Historia, as I mentioned in the last two Zelda theories I did, and I love that you're enjoying these kind of quirky alternative takes, the Hyrule Historia is a self-contradicting bit of evidence that claims itself to be just one tapestry, one telling of the events of Hyrule, with later iterations of the timeline changing the placement of certain games, and then Breath of the Wild seeming to not care about the timeline at all. The timeline was something that the creators of Zelda really didn't intend in the early days of the franchise, and that we theorists loved speculating about. And in the early 2000s, with the beginning of YouTube, it was really fun to see those early Zelda theory videos that got me making my own Zelda channel before I made this channel. And back then I had a common belief about the Master Sword, which I shared with many members of the community before the Hyrule Historia came out. So let's take our blades and slice up the history book. And let's talk about what I think was originally intended to be the history of the Master Sword and how I think it's going to tie in to Breath of the Wild 2. Casting our mind back to the year 2000s, many classic Zelda titles are already out there. Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, the original games, and A Link to the Past. And the Master Sword is appearing throughout many of these games as a sort of mainstay of the series. While the Master Sword wasn't in the original Zelda game, there was a special sword that was used by the hero, and of course in Majora's Mask it is set in an alternative dimension, world, reality. It's taken on a few looks over the years, but the main one that they seem to have settled on is this bluish purple hilt with, of course, a long blade. In the mid-2000s, we had also had like the Oracle games, which weren't super tied to the Zelda timeline, and there was also Wind Waker, which again featured the Master Sword, followed by its own little trilogy with Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks, and they seem to be their own sort of canon that deviated off sometime after Ocarina of Time. All of that was making sense, and the Zelda community was loving to theorize, but one of the big theory-based things that came out was, what's the deal with the Four Sword? See, also in the mid-2000s, at about the time that YouTube started, Four Swords Adventures, and the Minish Cap had all come out pretty much in that order. Four Sword itself wasn't like a full game. There was a story. You played as Link wielding this blade called the Four Sword that separated Link into 4 parts to defeat the Wind Mage Vati across Hyrule. But this was more of an extra mode for A Link to the Past's port to the Game Boy Advance, in which, if you had this version, you could access the Palace of the Four Sword, but I don't know that that's supposed to be canon. I think that's kind of like the dungeon creator in Link's Awakening in the new version. Not really part of the canon, just an extra bonus mode. And Four Swords was really just that, a little bonus mode attached to this remake, to this port. The true version of this experience was Four Swords Adventure, which took the core of Four Swords and expanded it into a full game with a full story. Vati's back again, this wind sorcerer with a giant eyeball that looks a lot like the eyeball that we see in Breath of the Wild 2. I'm just saying, it's very similar symbolism there. And at the end of the game, twist reveal, Ganon is back as the Demon King with a slightly different origin story, and Link can slay Ganon with the Four Sword, which is really unusual because other than the original Zelda game, we'd only really seen Link do this with the Master Sword. Across Zelda's canon, the Master Sword is thought to be the only blade that can repel Ganon, that can be the blade of Evil's Bane and stop him. But at the same time as Four Swords Adventures came out, so too did the Minish Cap, featuring another new sword and a slightly different altered history. Given to a hero of old from the skies, the Minish, or Picori of the past, blessed the hero with a sword with a purple hilt that looks very familiar to help the hero stay back evil. At the beginning of this game, this sword is locking a chest filled with all of the evil monsters of the world, and a sorcerer called Vati, same name as the big monster in Four Swords and Four Swords Adventure, came along and broke that seal, breaking the blade and releasing evil across Hyrule. You then spend the game as Link going around Hyrule with the Picori blade and building it back up, fixing it and turning it into something new by combining it with the elements found across Hyrule, and it turns into the Four Sword. While that's happening, the wizard Vati is turning into the big monster version of Vati as he's going after the light force from Princess Zelda, which is again clearly just another take on the Triforce. Actually, the light force never comes back up again, which leads me to believe that the light force probably is the Triforce. It's her piece of the Triforce, just history has gone on for so long that people have changed the name slightly. Fine. And back then, before Skyward Sword and the Hyrule Historia come out, my assumption was, oh, so that purple blade from the beginning, that was the Master Sword. The Minish Cap, Four Swords, and Four Swords Adventures must be set after all the other Zelda games, and the Master Sword sealed away evil, and then was destroyed by Vati, and then ultimately was reforged as the Four Sword, which makes sense as to why the Four Sword can kill Ganon at the end of Four Swords Adventures. That's a theory, well done, we're all happy. Oh, that would have been a nice clean way to end this theory, except we weren't all happy. Some members of the Zelda community felt that Minish Cap had to be much earlier in the Zelda timeline, before other games that featured the Master Sword, debunking this theory. They thought this primarily because the Minish Cap is the game where Link got his hat. I always hated this as a justification because we now know from Breath of the Wild that Link can, just not wear a hat. That's fine. But also, I just saw Minish Cap as the justification for this is when this Link got this hat, not that all Links got their hat. It didn't make sense. Plus, after the release of Skyward Sword, we know that the first Link in the timeline had a hat long before the Minish Cap Link. So to me, it didn't make sense that Minish Cap should go particularly early in the timeline. But clearly, it made sense to the people who wrote the Hyrule Historias, who placed Minish Cap right after Skyward Sword. But then followed by Four Swords, and then completely separate from Four Swords Adventures. Why did they do this? I don't know. Probably something to do with Ganon. I don't know what they thought the justification was. This trilogy of games that are clearly meant to go together have been separated across the Zelda timeline. That in itself was weird, but also it would mean that the Master Sword and the Four Sword could not be the same blade because the Four Sword appears before the Master Sword then reappears in the timeline. However, again, it continued to strike me as odd because if you took away the Hyrule Historia, which came out at the same time as Skyward Sword, if you took away that book, that bit of reading, and just looked at the evidence that was in the game, Skyward Sword tells a very similar origin to the origin of the Picori blade from Minish Cap. According to Minish Cap, this blade was given to them by the Picori, creatures who came from the sky, who are closer to the gods than anyone else. They bestow this sword to the hero to help him slay evil. Meanwhile, in Skyward Sword, the Master Sword starts as the Goddess Sword, a sword found in Skyloft, in the sky, and you take it around and you infuse it with various elemental powers to create it into the full Master Sword, much like the forging of the Picori blade into the Four Sword. And on top of that, both games feature races who live in the sky above the clouds. The Minish are said to be closer to the gods than any other species, and similarly the Loftwings are said to be the sort of chosen birds, the chosen animals of the gods. And the Loftwings have feathers, because they're a bird, but so do the Picoris. They have a little feather on their tail, some of them. I wonder if over time the Loftwings became the Picoris. That would seem to be silly, but in the only other game that features a sky city pre-Breath of the Wild 2, it's got a species that looks like it could be the perfect evolutionary middle point to these two creatures. I think this was the intention when they made the games. In all three of these games, there's a city in the sky, there's a race that belongs in the sky, and there's a clear transition between these characters. This would also mean if Minish Cap was set later in the timeline that the Master Sword becomes the Picori blade, which becomes the Four Sword. Also, it means that Minish Cap is set so far after everything else that bits of history have been altered and changed. They don't call it the Master Sword anymore, they call it the Picori blade. They don't call it the Triforce, they call it the Light Force. This, to me, all made complete sense, and would now mean that Minish Cap is set long after Breath of the Wild and Breath of the Wild 2. Which also really works, because while Breath of the Wild has references to a bunch of older Zelda titles, including the Minish Cap, none of those references for Minish Cap, Four Swords, and Four Swords Adventures lock those events in the past of this game. Zelda mentions the blade being drenched in twilight, implying that Twilight Princess was earlier, or that it's traveled through time, implying that Ocarina of Time and Skyward Sword obviously must have happened before Breath of the Wild. But references to Minish Cap, like Mount Colonel, are nothing more than location names. Could well be that this is the first seeing of Mount Colonel in Breath of the Wild before it appears in Minish Cap later on in the timeline. And for me, the final thing that kind of locks this all in place is the creatures that come out of the chest that were sealed away by the Picori blade. The image shows Octoroks and Moblins, and Moblins are a common part of Ganon's army. We know that Ganon will reappear, reincarnated a little bit later on in the timeline after Four Swords Adventures, but Moblins are part of Ganon's army, which means Ganon existed before this point for sure, and was sealed away by whatever this blade is. It's the Master Sword, guys. However, I can't totally celebrate just yet. Breath of the Wild 2 seems almost certainly to be set shortly after the events of Breath of the Wild, and it shows a broken Master Sword. So in my mind, Minish Cap and the Four Swords and Four Swords Adventures games, and potentially even the original Legend of Zelda and Legend of Zelda 2, happen after Breath of the Wild 2. However, as I mentioned earlier, once again we're going to be revisiting the skies above Hyrule, and there we can see symbolism that doesn't look too dissimilar to Vati. Could this be a reference of something to come in the future, or could this be the return of Vati finally debunking this theory for good? You're gonna have to let me know what you think in the comments down below. Also, if you've watched this long into a Zelda theory video that isn't even in line with the main canon of the timeline, hi, we think pretty similarly. Thank you for coming along and sharing this video with me. I really appreciate it. To me, it's like really fun to cast my mind back to the pre-Hyrule Historia days, because some theories like this make perfect sense before that book came out, and I still think those are really interesting stories to share, and I actually think Breath of the Wild only enhanced this theory and made it make more sense to me. So yeah, I'd love to know what you think in the comments. And of course, so hi, Hyrule historians.
Wow! Yay! Hop! Yup!
As always, a massive thank you to those of you who support this channel on Patreon. You make this channel possible, and a special thank you to the big patrons of this month, the Elgator, Jed Rubin, and Michael Hornshoe. Thank you.